All right, so the pertinent pages from Ferrier's book chapter on Mrs. Dalloway on this passage begins on page 31. Okay. And it's quite a bit different. I'm going to read the 3 paragraphs on 31 and then pause to give a little bit of commentary on them. And then we'll move on from there to some of the later moments. Okay. So he writes, if we are to understand the importance of hallucination, particularly Septimus's hallucinations in the novel, it is very important to distinguish it clearly from dream and fantasy, with which it is often confused. We are lucky enough to be able to perform a term-for-term comparison within the novel itself. It is not that Mrs. Dalloway contains a description of a dream, as is often thought, but we do find in it a passage which appears to stand in for a dream, which is perhaps more useful for a study of its mode of insertion within the text. This is the solitary traveler episode, which I read two videos ago. This episode, Ferrier continues in the next paragraph, comes to replace a dream of Peter Walsh's, which we do not know directly. A dream which, if we are to believe Peter Walsh's own retrospective reconstruction, revived a scene from his youth. But the time which separates Peter's going to sleep and his waking up, or more precisely the space which separates the narration of these 2 moments, is occupied by the description of a nurse seated on the same bench as he is, and knitting. The description itself fills only 5 lines, but the rest of the space, 2 pages, is occupied by a more than epic comparison, so long that one completely forgets its origin, its tenor, and so complex that it constitutes an episode in itself, that of the solitary traveler. Next paragraph. In the way in which this episode fits into the rest of the narrative, mimes well enough the passage from reality to dream. On one edge, which corresponds to the going to sleep, the transition is very gentle, just like falling asleep, because the episode is introduced surreptitiously via a comparison, developed out of all proportion, which only comes in second position after a first image, which is very reasonable in its dimensions. Quote, she seemed like the champion of the rights of sleepers, like one of those spectral presences which rise in twilight. End quote. But at the other end, the text ends abruptly, like a sudden awakening, on a typographical blank, which comes to emphasize a double absence. For the episode stops suddenly after the question, but to whom does the solitary traveler make reply? Which leaves us waiting for both its own reply and the reply it evokes. This well illustrates the relation between dream and reality, which are fundamentally asymmetrical, since an element of reality can be enclosed in the dream, or even provide it with a point of departure, as with the nurse, whereas the dream can have no place within reality, unless it becomes hallucination. Okay, so what should we take from these 3 paragraphs? For one, if we understand what Ferrier is doing here in terms of his larger argument, he's attempting to show how Mrs. Dalloway itself distinguishes at the very level of its style and use of language and narrative between madness and its hallucinations, associated with Septimus and a feature of the novel's own logic, and dreams or fantasies. The second paragraph we read does not quote the passage at all, but it helps us see an important distinction between summarizing what happens in a passage, that is, telling part of the story in our words, and attending to how discourse operates in this 2 to 3 page how the discourse of the novel operates in this 2 to 3 page scene. This distinction between story and discourse is the one that Seymour Chapman gives us, you'll remember, in his book Story and Discourse. Although discourse can have several meanings, what I mean it here simply as a word that refers to the specific literary and narrative ordering of the story in the text itself. Okay, and so that's what the second paragraph that I just read does. Ferrier isn't just summarizing what's happening, he's summarizing the sort of shape and the very specific ordering and presentation of those 2 to 3 pages for us. This description of the discourse sets Ferrier to zero in more closely on the moments of transition in the third paragraph between the reality of the waking world and the dream at the beginning of the passage, and vice versa, from the dream world to reality at the end of the passage. By quoting the bookends of this moment in the novel, he begins reading the novel's own theorization of an asymmetry or non-reciprocity between dream and reality. Quote, an element of reality can be enclosed in the dream or even provide it with a point of departure, end quote, as in the case of the knitting nurse, whereas the dream can have no place within reality unless it becomes hallucination. The final question of the dream sequence, but to whom does the solitary traveler make reply, does not follow Peter back into the waking world. Okay. The first 2 paragraphs on page 32, on the next page, spend just a little energy showing 2 additional ways in which the dream passage is modeled or structured on an asymmetry between 2 components, asymmetries that pale the asymmetry between dream and reality. In the first paragraph on 32, Ferrier shows that the many comparisons that the novel sets up within the passage operate by way of rhetorical comparisons, suggested metaphors, metonymies, etc., whose, quote, essence is to juxtapose 2 elements which touch at one point but remain fundamentally distinct, end quote. Despite the oddity of this solitary traveler passage, it is clear that the text is distinguishing it explicitly, stylistically, and even psychologically from the reality of the characters themselves. In the second paragraph, Ferrier spends time showing how the passage is even distinct at the level of verb tense. The lengthy use of present tense in these pages, rather than the typical past tense with blips of present tense, in other words, makes the distinction between reality and dream clear at the very level of verb usage, at the level of style, of diction, in short, at the level of discourse, at the level of narrative ordering itself. The long paragraph that runs from 32 to 33 is a little meatier. Okay, so let's read that one together. So bottom of 32. As for the content of this passage, it also allows us to establish certain distinctions. The topic of this episode, which stands in for a dream by its place, and imitates a dream by its form, is not, strictly speaking, a dream, but a daydream. This daydream is induced by changing forms engendered by movements of branches and light in the shade of the woods. These forms, rapidly glimpsed by the solitary traveler, seem to him to be a spectral presence, a giant silhouette. He immediately corrects his perception and recognizes the sky and the branches, but out of a desire to escape from reality, quote, a desire for solace, for relief, something outside these miserable pygmies, these feeble, these ugly, these craven men and women, end quote, he voluntarily imagines that these moving branches are women, now majestic, now wild. What difference is there between these visions? The term is used 3 times in this passage, and Septimus's hallucinations. Is it merely a difference of belief? Septimus believes in what he thinks he sees, whereas the traveler does not believe in the supernatural or in the existence of the fantastic being he thought for a moment he had seen. Quote, nothing exists outside us except a state of mind, he thinks, a desire for solace, end quote. But he does believe in a certain existence of the vision, provoked by a false perception, which has come to fill up this lack. Quote, but if he can conceive of her, then in some sort she exists, end quote. The traveler has used a pre-existent but buried image as an organizing form to order his perceptions, but he abandons this attempt for the coherence between this image and his perceptions, but for the coherence between this image and his perceptions, he abandons it because it does not stand up to examination. Having not been able to find this image in reality, he calls it up from within, at the same time as other visions support themselves on reality, like the movement of the branches. Yet they do not mix with it, really. They do not exist on the same level either for him or for us. To the extent that these visions are posited, the real world is denied, and vice versa. There is simultaneous consciousness of these two distinct planes, that is, of reality and of vision, and therefore a possibility of interaction. The real forms serve as food and model for the reverie, and the reverie can influence action in reality, but there is never any fusion of the two. The plane of the imaginary can be juxtaposed with the plane of the real, or even mask it. Quote, such are the visions which ceaselessly float up, pace beside, put their faces in front of the actual thing. They may even offer a substitute, quote, giving him a substitute for a general peace, end quote. But these visions are never confused, either for the character or for us, the readers. Okay. So what do we take from this long paragraph? Namely, that it isn't until this point that Ferrier actually turns his attention to the content of the passage. That up until now he has focused on its form and on its discourse, how it's ordered and how it's presented to us, without summarizing its content. But now that he's done that, he will show us what is going on with the very wording and the very action within the passage itself. He walks us through the mental mechanics of the passage's movements. Remember, he doesn't summarize, but again, he doesn't summarize what's going on. Instead, he walks us through an analysis of the mental mechanics of the passage itself. If this is an example of stream of consciousness, something Narramore is not sure of in his own reading, then what do we make of the content of the passage as the work of a mind daydreaming? Ferrier's close attention to the passage aims to answer this, and he winds up with the same conclusion as he's had when analyzing the form and discourse of the passage. Let's read it again, quote, there is simultaneous consciousness on the part of the daydreamer Peter of these two distinct planes of vision and reality, and therefore a possibility of interaction. The real forms serve as food and model for the reverie, and the reverie can influence action and reality, but there is never any fusion of the two. They are never confused, either for the character or for us, the readers. Why is Ferrier spending all this time showing how Mrs. Dalloway marks a clear distinction between dream or daydream and reality? Why show that the novel does this in several ways at the level of discourse, diction, form, and content? Because Ferrier is setting up how the visions that haunt Septimus do not follow this logic in the very same text. It is not so easy for us as readers to distinguish at the level of form or content between Septimus's hallucinations and the reality of the novel itself. I want to end by reading yet another close reading of a passage that Ferrier quotes on 33 to 34. To develop the distinction between dream and hallucination and their respective relationships within the text itself, he interprets the passage as follows. So this is Ferrier's interpretation of a passage pertaining to Septimus. Okay, I'm not going to read the passage pertaining to Septimus. I'm just going to read Ferrier's interpretation. Sorry, excuse me. The sentences italicized in the passage he just quoted, he quotes earlier on the page, express a version of things apparently irreconcilable with the hallucinated world presented by the rest of the text. And yet for Septimus, the two versions are not at all mutually exclusive, not at all asymmetrical in the way that dream and reality are, in the way that the spectral presence and the simple movement of the branches were for the solitary traveler. They exist side by side with the reality. The shepherd is at the same time an old beggar. Several spaces, Regent's Park, a mountain landscape, Septimus's bedroom, are superimposed over one another without any one of them becoming dominant. And nothing in the text allows us as readers to reestablish the supremacy of what is real over what is imaginary. On the contrary, in order to counterbalance our reading habits, our expectation of a certain plausibility, the narrator goes so far as to back up the hallucinated version with his authority. Let us return to the beginning of the paragraph. Quote, he lay back in his chair. At least is an objective description entirely taken on by the narrator. Septimus has no part in it. We can justifiably suppose that he does not think of his movement. But the paragraph continues in the same mode, and describes in the same tone the roses which grow through flesh, and the shepherd withdrawing into the snow. It is the reasonable rectifications which are held at a distance by the words "he muttered" or "he reasoned it out." The juxtaposition of the two sentences, quote, "The boy's pipe made its exquisite plaint while the traffic passed beneath. This boy's elegy is played among the traffic," thought Septimus, end quote, would tend even to suggest that the former does not come from Septimus's thoughts, as it is not in the present tense, like the proposition explicitly attributed to him, but in the past, like the narrator's "he thought." We don't even have to look at the specific passage that Ferrier is reading here in order to understand the brilliance of what he's doing. That the text itself, the novel itself, at the level of its form and content, incorporates Septimus's madness and hallucinations into itself and into how it operates. Madness in this sense is not just a theme of the novel. It's not just something the novel's about. Madness is the very logic of the novel itself. The narrator thinks as Septimus thinks, calls us as readers to read the world as Septimus reads it, without any indication that Septimus himself is thinking the thing that the narrator describes. There is a fusion here, in other words, between reality and unreality, when it comes to Septimus and to the novel, which is literarily hallucinatory, a fusion that is held at bay in the passage that represents and performs Peter Walsh's dream. So why have I gone at such great lengths to walk us through these approaches to the same passage from Mrs. Dalloway? Again, to demonstrate that a variety of close readings are possible from any given passage, and the sheer number of things that one can pay attention to within a passage. What you should notice in your own textual evidence, What you should notice is that what draws the eyes of the literary critics in each of these instances, not in your own, is the particular features that can be shaped into textual evidence, right? Right. And so Ferrier, for instance, quotes the exact same passages that Miller and Narramore quotes, but extracts something much different from it. Instead, he extracts from it a model of asymmetry between reality and dream, a model of correspondence that is not a model of fusion. And the reason he wants that is in order to juxtapose and contrast it to how the novel deals with madness and hallucination. Right? That when it comes to madness and hallucination, there is a fusion of reality and vision. Okay? And that fusion does not just occur in the mind of Septimus, but occurs at the level of the narrative itself, at the level of the text itself, at the level of the discourse itself. Okay? Or where Narramore and Miller take things that are much different from the Solitary Traveler episode. None of these three authors let the text speak for itself, but feel the need to do something with the text and with the parts of the passage, parts of this moment in the novel that they deem important for their argument. All three of them direct our attention to something in the text, or something about the text, something concerning the shape or the ordering of, or the presentation of the text. They don't simply summarize what happens. In fact, that's sort of difficult to do in this particular moment in the novel. Whether the critic's purpose is to highlight a problem, as in Narramore, or a self-referential nugget, as in Miller, or a key counterpoint to the novel's interest in and incorporation of madness, as in Ferrier, or some other goal or aim, what matters to the literary critic, right, about the textual evidence he or she draws from the novel needs to be made explicit to the reader. Anyway, I hope this helps as you begin formulating your second paper and sketching out your second paper. And with that, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Hopefully I'll get all these uploaded today without a hitch, and I'll write to you to let you know that they're up. If this lecture series on close reading has not been helpful, let me know, and I'll try a different approach to it. Okay, or we'll do a bit more practicing in class. All right. Okay. Well, I'm gonna go rest my voice and drink quite a bit more water, and hope for a bit more sun too. All right.